Today I'd like to talk about a new documentary that's been released on Netflix entitled Jimmy Savile, a British horror story. This is a documentary in two parts, each of them approximately an hour and a half long, so altogether it's about 3 hours in length. This is a very, very good documentary. And yes, it is on Netflix. Yes, you only will hear so much of the truth on a mainstream source like Netflix. But within the bounds of what is possible from a venue like Netflix, it's really well made, and I highly recommend it if you have Netflix. There is so much new footage from that is shown in this documentary. At least it was new to me. It's stuff that I hadn't ever seen before. Lots of old interviews, just lots of footage of this guy, this Savile guy, this creep, who just looked like a creep, or at very least a freak. It's really strange that nobody called him out for being just a freak. I mean, I guess people thought, well, he's just an eccentric. He never. The interesting thing, there are lots of interesting things. I mean, he's a fascinating case in a lot of ways, and by calling him fascinating, I'm not saying that I admire him or anything like that. But what's interesting about Jimmy Savile is he never made any effort to look normal, to look straight-laced, to look like an ordinary British citizen, or to act like anything that would be called ordinary or normal. His look was this mop of hair and loud clothes, bathrobes, short shorts. He's always going on runs. Suppose for one charity or another, he's running across the nation. Putting himself out there, putting himself on display, and always just sort of flopping around, just always doing shtick, with his cigar, always being obnoxious. But there's a really fine line between, being obnoxious and creepy and disgusting and making people uncomfortable. There's a fine line between that and being like just a sort of irreverent funny guy, and like he walked that line really astutely. I will say that for him. I say this because most I think it's probably true that most people who share his proclivity aren't the kind of people you could just pick out and say, hey, he looks like a pervert. But Jimmy Savile looked like it. I mean, he looked the part. And I'm wondering if there's something about, him having such a far out kind of crazy, creepy, just look and demeanor and everything about him being so out there. I wonder if in some way some people said to themselves, well, he couldn't really be that nasty of an individual. He couldn't do all of these horrible, nasty things to children, to handicapped people, to allegedly dead bodies, the kind of things that came out. The dude was prolific. Mostly young girls, but not just young girls, also boys. had stories to tell about him taking advantage of them, molesting them. Apparently, also, he was somebody who volunteered at hospitals and at a mental hospital and at a reform school for girls. He just had free reign in all of these places. He had the keys to get in and to go anywhere he wanted. He had no business being in these places, but then again, he didn't have any business being in Buckingham Palace either. But he was there a whole lot of the time, and he was really tight with the royals. Supposedly, Prince Charles and him were best buds. Margaret Thatcher just loved him, just adored him, pushed for his knighthood, eventually successfully. So this was somebody who had access to everything. The world was his oyster, and he as much as said so over and over and over again. You listen to him talk in all of these interviews, and he's basically giving the game away. He doesn't come right out and say, yeah, I'm raping kids every day. I've been getting away with it for decades, and I'm going to keep getting away with it for decades. He doesn't say that, but he on numerous occasions makes some off-color joke or some kind of remark that, again, you kind of just think, oh, he's just being a nut, he's just being irreverent. But it's strikingly strange to me that more people didn't just say, this guy says a lot of things that really shouldn't be said. Now sometimes it was funny. He was a funny guy. He was a funny guy. In the bad sense of funny, but he was also funny in that he had a sense of timing and he was witty and he was always very self-possessed. And you see him in a couple of interviews where there are reporters who are aware, who say later that they were aware that something was amiss, and who kind of ask him, they press him on certain things, like, why don't we ever hear about your personal life? Why don't you talk more about yourself and what you're up to, what's going on with you? You're always putting on an act, but what's really happening? And he, instead of getting annoyed or acting annoyed, instead of getting offended by these kinds of questions, instead of getting angry or losing his cool, he was really good. I mean, just expert level good at deflecting these questions, and making it seem like his deflections were just sort of a benign joke. He would be self-deprecating. He would, say, oh no, am I in trouble now, or something like that. There were times when he would indicate, he gave interviews where he would indicate things about his past which suggested that he was a bad boy, that he was a tough guy and spent time on the streets, and which he apparently did. You don't find this out from the documentary, but he had history with people who were in gangs and stuff in his early years, so he would sometimes this is the dark side of Jimmy Savile, and put these things out there, but none of those things would be suggestive of how really truly dark his behavior was. Just that he's sort of the, oh boy, Jimmy's coming to town, lock up your daughters. He's a charming rogue, and that kind of thing, and he's well connected. He'll fuck you up if he has to. That whole kind of thing. Like he's a tough guy, and he's a womanizer. but yet that existed side by side with the Jimmy Savile who was supposedly family friendly, who was beloved, who was this icon, who everybody loved and cheered for. And I mean, when I say everybody, of course, I'm being hyperbolic there. I'm sure there were people who didn't. I know that Johnny Rotten famously, now it's famous, but back in 1978, he said, "I know some things about Jimmy Savile, and I know if I talk about them, they'll make sure this interview never gets published. But I know he's a very sleazy man." And so it was, I believe, more of an open secret than the documentary really lets on. And this is where I think you kind of hit up against the point where there's only so much truth can be revealed in the mainstream media documentary, in a mainstream venue like Netflix. What you didn't find out about was that he apparently didn't just molest children for himself, but also procured children for others, and in that way compromised them, and in that way helped to keep himself hidden, because the people who would who knew these things about him, knew that if they talked, that he could expose them, because he had compromised them. In essence, that the culture that he was a part of, and I'm not saying all of British culture by any stretch, but the celebrity culture, the elite culture, the part of the culture that we know is sick and corrupt here in the United States and elsewhere. The same thing applied in Great Britain at the time, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, going on into the thousands. It's amazing how prolific he was, and how long he went on, without nary a peep from anyone. There were all these victims out there, and none of them wanted to talk. I mean, there were a few occasions where somebody here was, or there were like, 2 or 3 cases of victims who were talking to reporters, and like the story was about to break, but then it didn't. Something got in the way of the report ever being made of these allegations. So the rumors persisted, but they were never. But what people could always say was, well, show me the victims. If these people, if he's done all these things to children for so long, for so many years, why isn't there, one single accusation out there on the record? And there weren't people, going out there on the record claiming things, because they were too frightened. And the people who knew, who maybe could do something about it, more often than not, as I said, were compromised. Although that line you don't hear about much in the documentary. But what I would like to say to that is, you hear so often about things like Pizzagate and other similar phenomena. It's like, well, nobody's come forward. There have been no alleged victims, so this is all just clearly a hoax and a sham, and an alt-right conspiracy theory, and blah blah blah. Well, don't come at me with that, because here's why. Here's why you need not come at me with that line. Jimmy Savile worked in a high-profile manner for decades. I mean, he was out on the scene. I guess he started with Top of the Pops in like the 70s, but he was a known media figure before that. Like in the 50s and 60s, he was a DJ, and he was getting more and more popularity and acclaim, and sort of rising through the ranks during that time. And then later in the 70s and 80s, he was everywhere, and he was iconic. He was hugely high profile, and he was all that time a prolific rapist and molester um, of children and others and other vulnerable people, hospital patients, mental patients, people who were paralyzed, allegedly people, although this isn't covered in the thing in the documentary either, allegedly also corpses, and yet nobody talked, or nobody officially went on the record, almost for the entirety of his whole life, until he finally died at the age of 85. And then after his funeral, which was this huge event that was like worthy of a head of state or a member of the royal family, throngs of people in the streets showing their appreciation and support for this beloved icon. Then and only then did it start to come out, and it didn't even come out that quickly because the BBC, put the kibosh on these kinds of investigations. And what I, strongly suspect, this is not talked about in the documentary at all, but what I strongly suspect is that they knew. It was an open secret, but they either didn't have the nerve to talk about it, or they were compromised for the reasons I've described. Now, there were reporters who were on the case and knew about the rumors and were doing their best to try to expose him, and all credit be to them. But it took until after his death. So again, don't tell me, oh, there's no victims. Nobody has complained about anything. Nobody has said anything. Nobody's made any accusations. So it's obviously a hoax. Well, then obviously Jimmy Savile, all the accusations against him, everything that were said about him was just a hoax. Because for 50 years almost, he had a clean, spotless record. And it was, for any number of reasons, he got away with it. And he was powerful. He was well connected. He knew the royal family. He knew the prime minister. He was a big, powerful guy who had a lot of big, powerful friends. So overall, I would say, definitely see this documentary. In spite of the quibbles that I have about it, which really can't be helped. Given that it's released in a mainstream source like Netflix, it comes as close to saying the unsayable as it possibly can, and that's to its credit. Also, just sort of to wrap up my review or my analysis here, there are a couple of very interesting moments. One of the reporters actually uses the phrase mainstream media. You rarely hear that phrase used, except by people who are increasingly just regarded with hatred, suspicion, and contempt by the powers that be. The ones, but in this movie, in this documentary, one of the reporters points out that when the internet age began, there were no gatekeepers. Unfortunately, since then, the internet is much more gatekept than it was back then when it started. But still, the internet, it's still a freer place than the mainstream media will ever be. And so it was because of the internet starting up that people started to talk, like people who had been part of this reform school, or who were just talking to each other. They were sharing things, and they were talking about how Savile raped them and connecting with one another. And this was how eventually they started to form, to get in touch with former victims, and to eventually bring a case against him. But although that case never really was fully launched until after his death, unfortunately. So he never really had to pay, in this life anyway, for his many crimes. Another interesting thing is that David Icke makes an appearance in this documentary. Although none of Ike has talked extensively about Savile and others like him, and it's Ike is the one who talks about how Savile was a procurer, not just not just a molester. But there's a scene where David Icke is introduced, and this is before his whole before he really became known as David Icke, when he was just a sports broadcaster or a sports reporter. He had played soccer and then I think got injured, and then was a part of the media just reporting on sports. So he's in the studio with Jimmy Savile, a young David Icke with like this sort of fro, and that's kind of interesting, kind of funny. Anyway, that's my review of British Horror Story, David Icke, A British Horror Story. See it if you can. Thanks for watching.